My name's Scott Ritter. I was a Marine Corps intelligence officer who was selected to be among the first inspectors into the Soviet Union back in 1988 to implement the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. I gained a little bit of experience doing on-site inspections in an arms control environment. After the Gulf War, I was asked to join the United Nations Special Commission, where I served for 7.5 years as a weapons inspector and later a chief weapons inspector, helping oversee the disarmament of Iraq's chemical, biological, long-range ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons programs.
Can you just tell us the difference between an intelligence officer and a field commander? I think most people can understand you're in the middle of a battle, you're actually running a battle. What's the difference between that kind of officer in the forces and an intelligence officer?
Well, in the military, there's really little difference. Insofar as you're a commissioned officer, your first duty is to lead Marines in the case of being a Marine officer, and you do your job. So, a logistics officer leads Marines doing the job of logistics. An infantry officer leads Marines doing the job of the infantry, and an intelligence officer leads Marines doing the job of intelligence. Where it differentiates is that intelligence is often a lonely business. If you're an intelligence analyst, it's you versus the data. You're alone versus the data. If you're an intelligence collector, it's you and the technology collecting a specific piece of information. If you're a case officer, it's you and the asset that you're running, or you and the program you're trying to penetrate. It's a very lonely job. So as a Marine, that was my life. I either was commanding Marines or I was living a lonely existence as an intelligence officer doing various tasks to meet the requirements of the organizations that I reported to. With the United Nations, it was a very unique job because I was the lead intelligence officer, so to speak, for an organization that didn't have an intelligence organization. So I had to build something from scratch. I was also a field commander. So when I took a team into the field, we were carrying out an inspection task, a task that involved us trying to collect specific data related to our task of disarming Iraq. For the most part, our collection efforts were overt, meaning that we went there and declared what we were looking for. But because the Iraqis were engaged in a hide-and-seek game, much of our work was covert, secretly listening in on their conversations, using imagery, using human resources that the Iraqis didn't know about, doing an inspection designed to get the Iraqis to do something that could be detected covertly using other resources. So it was a very unique job where I got to blend both the leadership requirements of being a field commander with the intelligence collection requirements of being an intelligence officer.
The officer I spoke to from the British Army, he was saying, well, the intelligence that we got from Iraq turned out to be a hoax, all this stuff about weapons of mass destruction. So we are not going to trust them the next time. Maybe never trust the intelligence people again.
Well, I mean, I don't blame them. Intelligence is about trust. There's a difference between getting something wrong after giving it a legitimate shot. I mean, analysts oftentimes get it wrong. You're trying to piece together a puzzle with less than 10% of the pieces and tell people what the puzzle is supposed to show. It's a tough job, but and on that you can't fault them. I mean, remember, the intelligence officer's job isn't to tell the commander what to do or how to do it. It's to give the commander an idea of what he's facing so that he can make the most informed decision possible on how to accomplish the mission. The problem comes when the intelligence officer is asked to politicize his work. That is, to shape the evidence to achieve a foregone conclusion that isn't derived from a desire to hunt down what the truth is, but rather to shape events to meet a political agenda. And that's what happened in Iraq. The intelligence services were asked to take incomplete data and twist it so that it could meet a conclusion that Saddam Hussein's Iraq was pursuing weapons of mass destruction programs, and that would be used to justify military action against Iraq. And if that's the case, if an intelligence organization has been politicized, it can never be trusted again. And I'm on his side. I mean, this is why when you hear people say, well, the CIA said X today, don't believe it, because the CIA can no longer be trusted. I hate to say that. There's lots of good people in the CIA, but from their middle management on up, they've allowed the organization to become politicized. It's no longer a tool of fact-finding. It's a tool of opinion shaping. And that's just the reality. American intelligence has been corrupted by politics. I would say to a large extent, British intelligence has been corrupted by politics. And that's too bad, because I was part of the intelligence community back when facts mattered, truth matters, and your reputation as an analyst was dependent not on telling your boss what he or she wanted to hear, but telling them what the facts were.
Now, the intervention in Iraq, Kuwait too, were both had enormous after effects, including, most importantly, the interventions in Syria, for better or for worse. Now, it does look as if that's a ground to a halt now. What do you make of what's happened in Syria and where we are now with that? Because the Turks still actually controlling a lot of northern Syria, and this is something that goes right way back to the Ottoman Empire. The Turks have always felt, well, actually, we were robbed of this land in the Ottoman Empire back in the First World War, and so it's left a bit of an impasse. What do you make of what's how stable Syria now is?
Well, the Syria, for the most part, is stable because, for the most part, the government of Syria is legitimately elected president. Bashar al-Assad is in control of the majority of Syrian territory. There are parts of Syria that are under foreign occupation. You have the Turks, together with their Islamist allies, controlling Idlib in a big swath of territory along the Turkish-Syrian border. You have the United States occupying a very large section of northeastern Turkey and empowering a Kurdish minority in Syria to govern an autonomous section independent of the Syrian government. So, it's on the one hand, it's a far more stable situation today than it has been since anytime since 2011, 2012, when the current civil conflict began. But it is still a very dangerous situation because none of the occupying powers are there legitimately. They're all there in violation of international law. The Syrian government has not invited them, and they're working not in concert with one another, meaning that the Turks are not working with the Americans. The Turks are against the Kurds. The Americans are supporting the Kurds. And everybody's against the Syrian government, except the Russians, who are there fighting on behalf of the Syrian government, along with the Iranians and Hezbollah, who have irritated Israel, who is intervening. You see, it's a big mess. So Syria is a giant powder keg, waiting to blow up, and hopefully, saner minds will prevail, and the fuse will be cut before it reaches the powder, the explosive.
Yeah, it's quite a dangerous situation with the Russians involved too. The latest we've heard is also that the Iranians, the Israelis, seem to be actually committing acts of war with incredible regularity now, almost so regular that it doesn't even make a line on the news. Where, for example, this attacking the nuclear power station earlier this week with a supposed cyber attack, which caused an explosion at one of the nuclear plants creating uranium in Iran. What the Israelis say is, well, the Iranians are, number one, they're making nuclear weapons, which we don't want them to have. But number two, they are intervening around the Middle East in places like Yemen and Lebanon, where we don't want them. And that's why they're committing these acts of war. So the Israelis I'm talking about. So what do you make of these Israeli actions? Because it does seem as if at some point there may be, someone will hit back.
Well, first of all, the Israeli actions are just a blatant violation of international law. There's no legal justification for anything Israel's doing. It's not self-defense. It is purely blatantly offensive action solely for the benefit of Israel and no other nation. And the Israeli analysis is off. I mean, let's start with Yemen, because that's easier to explain. Saudi Arabia invaded Yemen back in 2014. The Houthi rebels who are resisting didn't start this conflict. They're going to finish this conflict, and they're going to finish this conflict with the assistance of the Iranians. Now, Iran was not firmly embedded in Yemen when Saudi Arabia invaded. It's only because of the Saudi Arabian intervention and the successful Houthi resistance that the Iranians were able to get their foot in the door. Now they've done so successfully, and Iran has provided sophisticated weapons in terms of armed drones, suicide drones, and medium-range ballistic missiles with a high degree of accuracy that the Houthi are using with great effect against the Saudis. And now that Israel and Saudi Arabia are allies, of course, Israel is going to take the side of Saudi Arabia and assist Saudi Arabia by seeking to contain Iran's actions in Yemen, but not just in Yemen, in Lebanon with Hezbollah, in Syria, and in Iraq and elsewhere. Iran has legitimate justification to be involved in every nation I just mentioned. First and foremost, they've been invited. Unlike Israel, who invites itself, Iran has been invited by the legitimate governing authorities to have a presence in Syria, to have a presence in Lebanon, to have a presence in Iraq, to have a presence in Yemen. So, what we call it malign activities on the part of Iran, but it's actually Iran's one of the few nations that's doing anything legal in the area. Then we can get to the issue of, Iran's nuclear program. First and foremost, the enrichment program that Iran is carrying out today is a legal authorized enrichment program under Article 4 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Iran has executed a safeguards agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency, the United Nations affiliated organization that oversees nuclear inspections of member states. In addition to these safeguard inspections, Iran had entered into an additional agreement, the Joint Comprehensive Program of Action, back in 2015, in which it voluntarily, or at least part of this agreement, it allowed additional restrictions on its nuclear enrichment capability that would eventually expire in what's called sunset clauses over a period of time. Iran didn't violate this agreement. In fact, the JCPOA board, meeting on a regular basis, certified Iran to be in full compliance with its obligations under the JCPOA. It was the United States that withdrew from the JCPOA in May of 2018, and then in May of 2019 started this program of maximum pressure, imposing economic sanctions designed to compel Iran to agree to negotiating a new agreement, something Iran refused to do. When Iran negotiated this JCPOA, they were very clever. One of the things that they insisted on was Article 26, which is if the United States or any other party reimposes nuclear sanctions unilaterally, Iran is allowed to undertake what they call remedial actions. That is to back away from its obligations until which time the other nations are returned to compliance. So everything Iran is doing in terms of installing new centrifuges, enriching to 20%. Now they're talking about going up to 60%. Stockpiling a larger amount of enriched material than would be permitted under the JCPOA. Everything they're doing is legally authorized under the JCPOA. There's nothing illegal about Iran's doing. Furthermore, everything they're doing is being monitored by the International Atomic Energy Agency, not through the intrusive inspections authorized by the JCPOA, but by the safeguards inspections that are a requirement of Iran's participation in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. That means that every microgram of nuclear material that Iran possesses is accounted for by the International Atomic Energy Agency. There's no diversion of enriched material to a nuclear weapons program. So anybody who sits here and says Iran has a nuclear weapons program simply doesn't know what they're talking about.
The Iranians are talking about going up to 60% enrichment. Obviously, for those of us that aren't nuclear scientists, Scott, this is a bit complicated, isn't it? The idea here is that we get naturally mined uranium and then we start to enrich it. Now, that means that we're getting a higher and higher concentration of the isotope of U-235, which is the most radioactive isotope of uranium. So what does it mean going up to 60%? Because I understand that there is a certain percentage, which means that you can then actually make an atomic bomb from it, a nuclear weapon from it. So whereabouts are we at 60%? Is that just okay? Need we not worry about that sort of thing?
Well, 60% is not usable in a nuclear device. If you produced, a couple tons of 60% enriched uranium hexafluoride, which is what's being enriched, by the way. It's a gas that would then have to be converted to metal form and purified before it could have any viability in a nuclear device. But you would need an awful lot of 60% uranium before, and then you have to compress it greatly before you could even get a fizzle. The ideal concentration for a nuclear weapon is between 90 and 95% enrichment. And 60% just brings you one step closer to achieving that objective, if indeed that is your objective. But by and of itself, 60% does not pose a proliferation threat to anybody. It's unusable in a nuclear weapon. It's practically unusable in any kind of nuclear device. And its sole function at this point in time, because Iran's nuclear reactors are not geared to using fuel enriched to 60%. They're geared to using fuel enriched to just below 5%. So this is purely a symbolic gesture by Iran telling the world that, look, we're not backing down. We're not the problem here. The problem is the United States. The problem is Europe. If the United States rejoins the agreement and Europe and the United States lift all the sanctions that they're not allowed to be imposing under the agreement, we'll bring all this back down to what we're supposed to be doing under the JCPOA. But if you're going to play games and try to, economically blackmail us into or pressure us into renegotiating a deal that's already been negotiated, we're not playing that game. And this is the price you're going to pay. New centrifuges with greater capability and Iran enriching to levels that start to make people uncomfortable.
Is there any reason why the Iranians shouldn't develop nuclear weapons? After all, they are threatened by Israel that does.
Well, there's a couple of reasons why they shouldn't. First of all, we'll start with, a discussion of, why people think they should have nuclear weapons. The North Korean model, first and foremost, is the best defense of having a nuclear weapon. North Korea has it, and the United States can't talk about regime change or initiating major military action against North Korea, because to do so would mean the nuclear destruction of their close allies in South Korea and Japan, and probably the death of tens of thousands of Americans at the hands of North Korean nuclear weapons. It's a deterrent. And one could argue that if Iran had nuclear weapons, it would cause the United States and Israel and Europe to take a different approach. I view it differently. If Iran had nuclear weapons, it would turn them into a legitimate target that would be vaporized instantaneously by either Israel or the United States. It just won't be tolerated. Moreover, Iran is an Islamic republic, and I think people need to understand and respect what that means. Under the Iranian form of government, you have, in addition to a democratically elected parliament and a democratically elected president, you have superimposed on this a supreme jurisprudent, the supreme leader, who is responsible for the guardianship of Islam and the Islamic faith as it deals with the nation. Iranians take their religion seriously. I'm not a Catholic, but it's therefore, I don't listen to what the Pope says. But if someone came out to me and told me that the Pope had issued an encyclopedic or whatever the Catholic term is for a religious edict, I would say that that's serious, that the Pope believes that, and we have to respect his faith and his belief. When the Iranian supreme leader issues a fatwa or religious edict, we have to respect that. And the Iranian leader, Ali Khamenei, has issued a fatwa, at least one, probably two, that declare nuclear weapons and all weapons of mass destruction to be haram or forbidden, incompatible with Islam. And so the main reason why Iran can't have a nuclear weapon is that if they went down that path and got one, they would delegitimize the supreme leader. They would delegitimize Islam, and that would, in a way, be delegitimizing the Islamic Republic as a nation state because they would stand for nothing. I take Iran seriously enough, and I respect their embrace of Islam enough to realize that when a fatwa is issued, there is a level of gravitas and seriousness that must be attached, and that's why I don't believe that Iran can have a nuclear weapon, because it's incompatible with its status as an Islamic Republic.
Now, this is a bit difficult, isn't it? Because we've got at the situation at the moment where we keep having the Israeli leader, President Netanyahu. Sorry, not the president, is he? He's Prime Minister Netanyahu. Even though he's being hauled through the courts for corruption at the moment, on a corruption scandal, he is constantly saying, that Iran is the problem. Iran, even having photo calls next to his nuclear research center at Dimona, talking about, threatening Iran constantly, really. I mean, almost all the time. This is a major part of his political platform. So is this just a stalemate which will go on and on, do you think? Or do you think at some point somebody is going to act? Because at the moment, the political situation in Israel is anything but stable.
No, it's a very dangerous situation. And when you have a politician that's backed himself into a corner domestically, they oftentimes turn to foreign crises as a way of distracting the public. Netanyahu has been saying since 1995 that Iran is on the cusp of developing a nuclear weapon. So, we're dealing with a 26-year threat that was supposed to manifest itself in a period of months. So why anybody takes him seriously is beyond me. But the fact of the matter is, we're not just dealing with the rhetoric of a desperate political leader. We're dealing with actions undertaken by a nation state. A cyber attack against a nuclear facility. I mean, let me put it this way. If either the United States or Great Britain had a foreign power carry out an attack on a functioning uranium enrichment facility that destroyed centrifuges while they were enriching material, that is an act of war. We'd be bombing them into the Stone Age within a day. That's just a statement of fact. We wouldn't sit back and go, oh, well, we're going to see what happens. Israel carried out an act of war. Israel assassinated a leading civilian nuclear scientist in Iran. Again, if either the United States or Great Britain had a serving nuclear scientist assassinated by intelligence services of a foreign power, that is an act of war. We would be engaged in conflict with them right now. Iran has shown a tremendous amount of constraint and restraint because Iran understands that what Israel is trying to do is lure it into a trap. And that trap is that Iran would overreact and turn the world against it, and there would be no hope of Iranian economic recovery. The Iranians, on the other hand, recognize that the goal here isn't to go to war with Israel. The goal is to avoid a war with Israel while getting economic sanctions lifted so that Iran can resume normalized economic activity. So the Iranians are far more mature and far more reasoned and far more balanced than the Israelis are. And unfortunately, the world has grown accustomed to giving Israel carte blanche, a free hand at doing whatever it wants to do in the name of Israeli security. At some point in time, something's going to have to give. Either Iran is finally going to have enough and they're going to strike Israel back. And this is another reason why Iran doesn't need a nuclear weapon. Iran has perfected the art of the precision-guided long-range ballistic missile with a conventional warhead. The Americans learned this the hard way at Al-Assad when these missiles came down with pinpoint accuracy and destroyed every building on that base that needed to be destroyed. That same level of accuracy can be applied against Israel today by the Iranians and their Hezbollah allies in Lebanon, with thousands of precision-guided munitions hitting whatever they want to hit in Israel, destroying it. And the Israelis know this. So the Israelis, have to be careful here when you kick a hornet's nest, don't be surprised when the hornets come out and sting you. And right now, Israel's doing a lot of kicking, and the Iranian hornets showing a little bit of restraint, but eventually it won't. The problem with Iran attacking Israel is that it will become a regional conflict, and now Iran will do the same thing to the totality of the oil production capacity of Israel and America's allies in the Middle East. That means Saudi Arabia ceases to produce oil, not just for a year, 2 years, 5 years, for 20 years, for 30 years, maybe forever. The same with Kuwait, the same with United Arab Emirates, the same with Bahrain, the same with any oil producing state that Iran decides to terminate as a producer of the black gold. So that would destroy the world economy. So Iran has a great deterrence. Now, Iran would pay a heavy price. It would probably be the end of the Islamic regime. But the world would pay an even heavier price, in terms of the totality of economic impact. So maybe it's time for the United States or for a collective of international community members to come together and tell the Israelis to stand down. Because Israel is writing checks with its actions that it can't cash. The world will end up cashing them on behalf of Israel, and the world doesn't need to be cashing those checks. Like the situation in Syria, the current state of affairs between Israel and Iran is a powder keg, an even larger powder keg with a shorter fuse. Very dangerous situation.
Apparently, it'd be interesting to see if you think it will really happen this time. We've heard that both the British and the United States, I suppose this was certainly originally a NATO force, is withdrawing its troops from Afghanistan as a threat. Apparently, the Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram and these various other ISIS and Al-Shabaab say that they're going to pay a heavy price, which I find surprising. I'd have thought they'd be partying and celebrating if the British and the Americans are pulling out of Afghanistan. Celebrating a victory rather than getting angry. But anyway, what do you make of this move to pull troops out on the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks? And do you think it will really happen?
Well, first of all, understand that the mere fact that you're saying we're going to pull troops out by the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks means that this is about domestic policy, not about national security policy, which means Afghanistan hasn't been about national security policy for some time now. It's been a domestic policy issue. We've invested so much into the concept of victory that we've been unwilling to accept anything other than victory as an outcome. The Biden administration carried out a whole of government approach towards looking at Afghanistan. The military continued to come back and say, we can win this. Give us another chance. Let's keep the resources in there. We got to keep going. The CIA said the same thing. But every other institution in the United States came back and said, there is no condition that can be imposed on Afghanistan that will result in a victory. And if we keep trying to impose these conditions, we'll be there forever, and the result will be the same. So Joe Biden has made what I feel is a brave decision. He said, we're out without conditions, meaning that Boko Haram, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, they can do whatever they want in Afghanistan. We'll blow them up. We'll kill them for another year, but we're leaving. And when we leave, it's up to the Afghan government to survive. We can provide them weapons. We can provide them stuff, just like we did with the South Vietnamese. We withdrew in 1972. By 1975, Saigon fell to the communist forces. And I believe that's the fate of the Afghan government in Kabul. We will leave in September of 2021. And within a year or so, the Taliban will be in total control of Afghanistan. Tragic for the Afghan people, but a reality that we can't change. And it's high time we leave. And I think it's a good thing that we are leaving.
Also, further sanctions being imposed on Russia, certainly here from Britain. And we've had for 3 weeks now, Anatoly Antonov, the Russian ambassador to Washington, has not been in Washington. Now, this is the first time, as I understand it, this has ever happened since the Russian Revolution. Even during the Russian Revolution, there was still an ambassador in Washington, obviously a Bolshevik one for a while, and then another one after that, and before that they were replaced. But there was still something going on. And I find it extraordinary that this has been so little reported. I wonder if you think it's as significant as I do, Scott, that we have no Russian ambassador in Washington for the foreseeable future now.
Well, it's not only it's tremendously significant. It's not just that Moscow recalled its ambassador. Normally, if you recall an ambassador, he meets very soon with the president to try and craft a policy response to whatever situation prompted the recall of the ambassador to begin with. The Russian ambassador has not met with Putin and is not scheduled to meet with Putin and will not meet with Putin because the Russians are not interested in having relations with the United States anymore. They're not interested in having relations with the United Kingdom. They're not interested in having relations with Europe. Not the way that the US, the UK, and Europe want to have relations, where we dictate the terms to the Russians as if they're inferiors. The Russians have made it clear they are not our inferiors. They are our equals, and they will be treated with respect. And until which time we treat with them with respect, they're going to sever relations. And indeed, that's one of the options that are on the table right now, the total severance of relations between Russia and the West. And that's not just diplomatic relations. Russia will voluntarily exit the SWIFT system, the international banking system. Russia will decouple its economy from Western currencies. And Russia will work with other nations to do the same thing. Russia's just had it up to here, and I'm putting my hand above my head, with the arrogance and the hubris of the United States and Great Britain and in Europe, trying to dictate terms to Russia that would be unacceptable to any other nation. And you see the Russian action. Ukraine put 25,000 troops and 300 tanks along its border with the Donbass, threatening an offensive action. Russia responded with 50 to 80,000 troops, thousands of tanks, and said, if you do this, you will cease to exist as a modern nation state. And Russia's not bluffing. And the West knows this. Europe knows this. NATO knows this. And there is no response to the Russian military actions. There's nothing anybody can do. And Russia's getting ready to play that game across the board. Russia's going to start flexing its muscles as it sees fit, not irresponsibly, but in a manner which is pursuant of Russian interests. And they don't care what the West thinks anymore, because the West has not shown itself to be a responsible, mature, reliable partner when it comes to, peacefully coexisting on the planet. I'm not saying the Russians are innocent. Did Russia carry out a cyber attack against the United States? Probably. But we do this on a daily basis, and so do the British. Sit here and pretend that we're not doing the exact same things to the Russians, or even on a higher degree, is the height of hypocrisy. Russia carried out a cyber attack. They didn't destroy anything. It was purely an intelligence collection operation. And we blow our stacks. We get embarrassed. We retaliate. Whereas in 2019, we carried out a cyber attack against the Russian power grid that actually destroyed things, disrupted things. So, which probably prompted the Russian solar wind cyber attack to begin with. So, we are hypocrites. And Russia's just tired of dealing with us, and I don't blame the Russians.
What about their capability were a war to break out there? Because, we know, don't we, there's this whole disputed region of the Donbass, which the Ukrainians have made it absolutely clear they want to reclaim that. In fact, they've been even doing things like drone strikes into there, where a young man was killed recently and that sort of thing. They are they're pushing to get that part of Ukraine back, and some people will say understand, and that's justifiable. No wonder they want part of their country back, which was taken over during the coup in Ukraine in 2015. So this is a potential powder keg as well, I suppose. What would you make of what would actually happen in a fight if that was to turn to a fight there? Would the NATO troops arrive in Ukraine? Because Ukraine isn't yet a member of NATO, is it?
Well, let's start off by saying this: NATO, instigated by Poland and the Baltic states, have said that Russia is a threat to the Baltic republics and Poland, which are NATO members. And as a result, NATO created 4 battle groups that they sent up. These are reinforced battalion-sized elements attached to a nation. So France has one, Great Britain has one, the United States has one. Somebody else has one. I don't know, the Italians, the Spaniards, somebody has a battle group up there. This is a battalion, reinforced. It took all of Britain's capability to put this battalion in the field. It took all of Germany's capability to put this battalion in the field. It took all of France's capability to put this battalion in the field. The United States has deployed a heavy armor brigade to Poland. That's all we got. And that's not enough. Rand Corporation did a study that said if a war broke out, Russia would take over the Baltics in 6 days and be at the gates of Warsaw. And there's nothing NATO can do to stop them. And this is with NATO fully committing the totality of its viable ground combat force in the Baltics. NATO has nothing to send to Ukraine. Nothing. They can't send it. Even if they wanted to send something to Ukraine, they can't. Moreover, NATO will not send anything to Ukraine as NATO because NATO is a consensus-driven organization. And right now, the majority of NATO is not supportive of Ukraine and what Ukraine's doing. Germany, France have both spoken out. They both said not only do we not support what Ukraine's doing, but we don't want Ukraine to be a member of NATO. Ukraine is beefing up this fight with Russia in an effort to get NATO to bring it in, to bring NATO into the fight. They failed. Now Ukraine's staring two Russian armies in the face. These are corps-sized, the equivalent of Western corps that are trained, equipped, and prepared to carry out deep offensive strike operations. If Ukraine was dumb enough to pull the trigger on the Donbass, the Ukrainian army would be destroyed in a week, and Russian forces would be at the gates of Kiev. And there's nothing the Ukraine or the West can do to stop them short of nuclear weapons.
What about the policy on nuclear weapons, though, Scott? Because I know there's been some shifts in the British policy more towards the idea of using nuclear weapons in a first strike, even saying, for example, that they could be used in retaliation for a cyber attack, which I found pretty surprising. How safe are we, do you think, that nuclear weapons wouldn't be used? And are there small nuclear weapons that maybe a battlefield commander might decide to use that would actually turn a war nuclear in a smaller way than we were used to in the Cold War?
Well, the British policy, the new British policy is roughly parallels the American policy, which, again, under Donald Trump and even earlier under Barack Obama, broadened the conditions under which nuclear weapons could be employed. You know, there used to be a time when the United States and the Soviet Union recognized that to use nuclear weapons was suicide. So they implemented a policy called mutually assured destruction. That is, if anyone uses a nuke, we all use nukes and we all die. Therefore, the greatest deterrence for not using nukes is the fact that it's an act of suicide. Today, somehow we've convinced ourselves that nuclear weapons are viable. And the notion that we could initiate a small nuclear conflict and somehow intimidate the Russians into not escalating is absurd. Vladimir Putin has just said outright, if a single nuclear weapon is used against us, we launch everything. Everything. So, and people maybe think he's bluffing. He's not. So the concept that we can fire a low-yield nuclear weapon against a concentration of Russian conventional forces as a means of sending a signal to Russia not to escalate further, it's just the first act in a larger act of global suicide, because Russia will immediately launch everything it has, and then whatever survives will launch against the Russians, and then the world will end in in a holocaust of fire, and then later nuclear winter. So no, there's simply no justification for what the British are doing, what the Americans are doing, or even what the Russians are doing. It's irresponsible by all parties. It would be nice if we could get back to the golden days of arms control and nuclear disarmament. One of my first jobs in the Marines was as a weapons inspector in the Soviet Union, getting rid of intermediate range and short range nuclear missiles. It was the first time we actually eliminated a class of nuclear weapons. It would be nice if we got back into that kind of activity instead of this irresponsible arms race and muscle flexing that we're doing. I mean, for the British to talk about increasing the number of warheads on their Trident submarines is a tragic joke. I mean, the rest of the world sees it. I don't know why the British don't see it.
We've heard some reports that the Chinese and maybe other nations have got these submarine killers now on satellites, where they can actually track and spot these submarines, which for many years during the Cold War were supposed to be secret. I wonder whether those Trident submarines might now be obsolete, Scott. What do you think?
Well, what I can say is that if I were the Russians, I would be expending a tremendous amount of resources into tracking down American and British and French ballistic missile armed submarines, so that if the balloon was ever to go up, we could kill those submarines before they could launch their missiles. Whether or not this capability exists, I don't know. But I do know that people have been trying to perfect that, and I do know that the Russians and the Chinese are very clever, very technologically advanced, and If someone's sitting back thinking that we have these nuclear armed submarines that are, invincible, can't be touched, and you're putting all your eggs into that basket, don't be surprised you wake up one day and find out you got no eggs left.
Well, let me just ask you about the domestic stuff, Scott, because there's a lot of people asking a lot of questions about this COVID pandemic. I wonder what you make of it. It certainly does seem that there are some treatments for that. They're very cheap, which don't cost anywhere near as much as the multi-billion pound vaccine program, which could have saved, up to, certainly some of the doctors I've spoken to, talking about up to 80% of those people that have actually died. These substances like ivermectin and chloroquine, which are basic, cheap, out of patent treatments, or even ivermectin. The patent was just simply released, given up, because the big drug company Merck that owned it wasn't making enough profit at it. What do you make of this whole, the lockdowns and the release of COVID and its potential origins?
Well, I'm not a medical doctor. I'm definitely not an epidemiologist. What I am is, somebody who's spent a career in the intelligence business, collecting and assessing data, including scientific data. I like to trust the science. I want to know what the science says. I want to know that 2 + 2 = 4. And so when I hear people say, this is scientific fact, but then they don't provide the data, I'm immediately suspicious. When people say that, this model is producing this outcome, I want to know more about that model. And when later on I find out that model was flawed, they've replaced it with yet another model that turns out to be flawed. And in fact, every model they've put out there has been flawed. I don't trust the science. I think that this COVID's real. Look, I had it. My wife had it. We were sick. We were locked down here and quarantined in our house for, 10 to 14 days to recover. We lived. It was a bad flu. For us, I understand it can be worse for some people. It can be even not as severe for others. But it's a real disease. It exists. It's not a hoax. But does it justify the economic devastation of the world? And again, I'm not saying that we shouldn't lock down. What I'm saying is the science that they used to justify a lockdown was fundamentally flawed. That the decision to lock down was not scientific based, but rather a political overreaction by politicians who didn't know what the hell they were doing. I would also say that while I'm sure that the medical scientists out there looking for a cure, looking for a vaccine, are doing so in good faith, but their efforts have been politicized as well, with emphasis placed on something and then lack of emphasis placed on something else. I think once we bought into the lockdown, anything that provided a fast and easy way out of this pandemic was rejected because it would be a political embarrassment for the politicians. This whole thing has become politicized, and that's the tragedy, because somewhere out there is science. There is the data that would lead us to a proper course of action. But we're ignoring it because this entire pandemic has been politicized, not only in the United States, but around the world. We're using it to beat up on China. We're using it to isolate Iran. It's just a tragedy. So when I hear the government say, trust us, what we're doing is science-based, I say, nope, this is like WMD in Iraq, man. I don't trust you at all.
And also, I don't know what it's like in the States, but in Europe, we've got this almost like vaccine war going on between AstraZeneca and Pfizer. If you're looking at the sales figures and what we had was the Pfizer one came out first, and then the number of people being injected, including the royal family, with that started to peak. Then we had AstraZeneca come up, and when it came into March, we started to get more people actually choosing to have the AstraZeneca one, which is more of a traditional vaccine, less experimental than Pfizer. And now all of a sudden we've had a whole load of news stories saying the AstraZeneca one is dangerous, and so the Pfizer one has overtaken them. I just wonder if this is a kind of marketing exercise rather than, as you were suggesting there, that the science is getting buried. But anyway, the main question in all of this, Scott, which everybody wants to know the answer to, most journalists don't seem to dare to ask, is the origin? Because we know, for example, over the last 40, 50 years, there have been a few nuclear weapons that have gone astray. There were some in the Indian Ocean, for example. There have been others, the nuclear weapons created by the South Africans too. But what about biological weapons? Do you think it's feasible that this was actually made in a lab and either got out accidentally or on purpose?
Well, again, I'm not a biologist, so I have to read things and decide whether or not to give any weight to what I read. I've read enough about the articles written by forensic biologists who have taken a look at the COVID virus up close and personal, and the markers that one would expect to find if this were man-made don't exist. So according to these people, this is from the wild. This came from the wild. This is an act of nature. So that's the direction I'm heading right now. But again, I say that as somebody who cannot form independent judgment based upon my own expertise as a scientist. This is based upon my reading other people's opinions, and I'm a prisoner to the data and the analysis that they conduct.
But what we're now, surely, Scott, we're now in almost like a wartime, or we have been for the last year. We're starting to open up here a bit in the UK. In almost like wartime conditions. You're not allowed to travel. In France, you've got a 7 p.m. curfew. If you want to go outside your immediate area, you have to carry papers with you. You've got to give good explanations for moving around literally to the next town.
Yeah, it's an assault on freedom. And what bothers me is that, we live in so-called democracies, but, I think the citizens of free nations have taken their freedom for granted, and they're not defending it as strenuously as they need to, because once you surrender freedom to a governing authority, that governing authority is very reluctant to relinquish that back to the citizens. And so, we're allowing governments to establish various systems of control over the public in the name of the pandemic. And we may find that at which time this pandemic is over, the governments are reluctant to allow life to return to normal, because governments are about control. And right now we're ceding control of our lives, of our freedom, of our liberty to governments in the name of, securing us from the threat of COVID-19. Again, no one has not been able to define what exactly this threat is and how it manifests itself in any scientific-based way, because every model they use turns out to be flawed. But we're willing to surrender, constitutional rights, basic freedoms that otherwise, under any other circumstance, we'd be in the streets fighting to the death to preserve. But somehow, because it's COVID-19, we're being compliant Pavlovian dogs and sitting back and allowing the master to ring the bell, and we sit down and drool.
Scott, whereabouts can people follow your work? Or, I don't know if you're doing articles regularly for a specific site, or I guess a Twitter handle, that sort of thing.
Well, I write for a number of sites. The one that I'm most prolific in, if that's a word, is RT, Russia Today. So if you go to Scott Ritter at RT, you'll see a list of articles. I also publish them on my Twitter feed at Real Scott Ritter on Twitter. So every article I write is published there, and then you can read all the people who like it and hate it, and you can form your own opinion.
Scott Ritter, thanks very much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me.